welcome to On the Ledge podcast, the show for people who are just popping to the garden centre for a look and in no way end up spending their entire food budget on succulents. No way. Never. This week we're continuing the show's occasional series on sustainability, interviewing Dave Hanson, who is owner of Sage Garden Greenhouses and the co-host of the Grow Guide podcast. He's been on a mission to ensure his business grows plants sustainably, so we're going to highlight some of the many components of sustainable gardening and find out what to look out for when you're choosing where to source your plants. Plus, I'm answering a question about that old saw, variegation in aroids. But first, and most thrilling, if you've ever listened to one of those crime drama podcasts where you never actually find out who done it, you may have been wondering if our story about the mystery Peperomia spotted by Charlotte in a Montreal cafe was going to end in a disappointing conclusion. O ye of little faith! This is On the Ledge podcast, with a listenership so fiercely intelligent and tenacious that once they've got their teeth into an investigation, they're never going to let go. And so if you remember, Charlotte wanted help identifying a red-stemmed peperomia that looked a bit like a Chinese money plant, our old friend Pilea peperomioides. But what's up with the red stems, Charlotte was wondering. We had various suggestions as to what the plant was after I aired this question. And we also had a theory that it was a Chinese money plant that had been given extra carbon dioxide in the greenhouse where it was raised, or that the plant was under stress. But what we really needed was a picture of the plant. I put a call out for Montreal listeners to come forward, and a couple did to volunteer themselves to go and check out this mystery plant. And Clara was the listener who ended up going on this mission for On the Ledge. She had a bit of a struggle because the plant wasn't in the same spot as it was when Charlotte visited, but she emailed me with a triumphant picture of the plant a few days ago. So I promptly posted this onto Facebook and had some great responses. Everyone got very excited, let's put it that way. But the conclusion was that it is indeed a Pilea peperomioides. And Leon Van Eck, who's a biologist and a listener to On the Ledge, provided an excellent piece of evidence for us. He had 2 pots of Pilea peperomioides, 2 divisions made from the original mother plant, one grown in deep shade in the greenhouse and one exposed to a lot more direct sun. And he posted a picture of these 2 plants and said, "Note the red petioles on the plant on the left. I hope this explains the phenotypic variation seen in this species as being likely environmental rather than genetic." And I will post that picture in the show notes so you can take a look. If you've never heard that term before, phenotypic variation, then let me just explain. That just means the variations that occur within a plant species. So, for example, if you see a dandelion growing in a crack in the pavement, it will look a lot weaker and smaller than a dandelion growing in a lush lawn where it's getting lots of light, nutrients and food. They're not different species, but they are being affected by the environment that they're in. And it's just the same for this Chinese money plant. Put it in greater sun and the plant reacts by changing the balance of pigments in the foliage. So take a look at your Pilea peperomioides and see how it's looking, and maybe try moving it to a sunnier or shadier spot and see if it works for you. Thanks to everyone for your responses to this particular query, and it's been such fun. So if you've got a mystery that you'd like On the Ledge to solve, then please do send me an email. I would love to help, and so would our band of wonderfully passionate listeners. You just need to email ontheledgepodcast@gmail.com and I will do the best I can to help you. Lots of information's great. Pictures, locations, story behind the plant. Waffle on as long as you like, and that will help me to answer your question as accurately as I can. And a special greeting to 4 individuals who are new to the On the Ledge Patreon family: Miranda, Memo, Leah and Sindel, who have all become legends and are no doubt binging on all the extra content you get if you donate $5 a month or more to keep On the Ledge going and funding important things like transcripts, new equipment, travel to interview people and all the stuff that makes On the Ledge work. So thank you to those 4 new Patreon subscribers. Find out how you can become a Patreon subscriber in the show notes at janeperrone.com. And many thanks also to Deja Vudia, who left a review of On the Ledge on Apple Podcasts, saying, I love listening to Jane and keeping up with her outings. Yes, I love going on outings. It's a great pleasure to be able to do that for On the Ledge. Her Q&A is always very helpful, and the jazzy music is always a plus. Star emoji. I don't know what that emoji is called. Perhaps it's not called star emoji. The one with the big star and then 2 little stars. It's an underused one. I think we should all start using that. Thank you very much for that review. 5 stars, Natch. And if you want to leave a review for On the Ledge and haven't done so, get your skates on, get over to your pod app of choice and say what you want to say about On the Ledge, because that way you can help other people find the show and generally give me a warm and fuzzy feeling inside, which is always good. So without any further ado, let's get on with the main interview for this episode. If you haven't listened to episode 103, which is Houseplants and Sustainability Part 1, where I talk about peat-free compost with Sean Higgs of Floralive, the carnivorous plant experts, then do go and have a listen to that first, because that show does lay out some of the issues with peat that we expand on in this episode. But sustainability is about much more than peat, as we find out in our interview with Dave. I'll let Dave introduce himself.
So my name is Dave Hanson, and I am the owner, co-manager of Sage Garden Greenhouses in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. I'm also the co-host of the Grow Guide podcast and longtime gardening columnist here for local radio and a variety of media as well.
So sustainability is at the heart of what you do, but was that a sudden epiphany, or have you been doing this for a long time?
Well, this is definitely something that's had an evolution over about the 22 years that I've been involved as a commercial grower. And when I started my business, I was a really young guy, and it basically grew out of a note when I was at a pub one night and I'd been working at a garden center. I thought, to heck with working for someone else, I'm going to start my own business, and literally was renting greenhouses and kind of doing everything improv. But the one thing that stood out to me right from the very beginning is just how much when I went to other garden centers, they kind of smelled of chemicals. And I did not like the idea of becoming involved in a business and an industry where I would go to work and be surrounded by basically a chemical aroma. And secondly, when I first started my business, I was very much keen on growing a lot of unusual edibles, a lot of herbs, and that's all about the sensory and aromatic type experience. And I really wanted to be able to feel confident for my own purposes, but also as I share that with others, that the plant material that I've invited everyone to scratch and sniff and to kind of get intimate with would be very, very healthy. So right from the beginning, this was a central guiding message in how I wanted to go about growing things. And as a young gardener as well, I'd always grown up in an environment where sustainability was important. Both of my parents are very much believers in sustainability and had been hippies out of the 60s and 70s. So I kind of had a background that way as well. But as the business grew, there was definitely epiphanies along the way in terms of how we could take this to the next level. How can we source organic fertilizers and find solutions for the various problems that come up as you start to grow instead of a few thousand plants, but you start to grow tens of thousands of plants, things do change.
I guess when you're growing on a large scale, the issues are different. In fact, I was interviewing somebody about the issue of peat for another publication that I write for, and they were pointing out, which had never really occurred to me before, that when you've got a nursery and you're thinking of trying a different potting soil formulation that doesn't include peat or is more sustainable in some way or other, you can't just go, I'm just going to sample a couple of bags of this. It's a major operation to change your potting mix. And so I guess that's an issue when you're growing on a large scale. Everything has to be planned far in advance. You can't have supplies failing or things going wrong because that's your livelihood.
That's a really central point. And along our journey towards a more and more sustainable type operation, we've had a few of those hiccups where we had a supplier, for example, recommended a new kind of fertilizer. It was called turkey trot that we could mix into our potting mix. And the only thing that went wrong with this is they told us to mix it in at a ratio that was 10 times the actual recommended amount. And we were like, well, it's springtime. Let's go for it. We're going to mix it into all of these pots here. And that was a pretty devastating situation when the plants basically became burned, even though it was an organic type fertilizer. It was very, very rich. And some plants like basil kind of glowed green and other plants just turned this limp, horrible color really fast. So yeah, you have to plan. You have to be aware of a longer term strategy. And I think that's one of the reasons that some of the larger operations and even some of the medium and smaller sized operations have been reluctant to do a lot of experimenting, or stayed very focused on maybe, say, their tomato plants or their edible section, but not necessarily to undertake to be more of an organic, sustainable type operation throughout the whole facility.
Tell me the temperature on peat in Canada. Are people trying to reduce the use of it, or is it just seen as something you've got so much of it's not a problem?
Well, you're spot on in that I'm right in the heart of peatland. We are in one of the places in Canada, in Manitoba, where a lot of the horticultural peat is dug from the ground and transported out throughout North America. So it's definitely an industry here, and so that has some bearing on people's attitudes for sure. No question, there's a lot of awareness that peat is a non-renewable resource that has tons of issues associated with how it's being removed, how that affects the landscape, and whether that landscape would ever return to what it once was. The peat companies, of course, have tried to argue that they're finding increasingly sustainable ways to not kind of pillage, I guess you could say, but no question that it's not a sustainable option. Locally, because the industry is so heavy on peat, I would agree that many people talk about this, they think about it, and then fall short on solutions. And I know that in other parts of North America, California, places like that, there's the option of rice hulls. I know that out of the US, there's a company now that's doing a lot with wood fiber that's been turned into basically a growing medium. And locally, we've been trying to work with a company that does a lot with an organic wheat straw. So there are options out there. And a couple of factors I think are coming into play here. One is what you talked about earlier, that is, someone has to be able to jump into this and feel confident they're going to get the same results, because customers are not going to be consumers at the end of the day aren't going to be very willing to accept a subpar product, or a product that is much more expensive, or a product that is not on schedule if a grower decides to make a change. So we have a lot of research and development, I think, that needs to take place, and you have to have financial resources to do that. So we have to have some companies that are, or the government or universities or someone who's willing to take the risk to really do proper trials to be able to introduce to market true alternatives for this big industry we have. But on a smaller scale, I think home gardeners are finding that there are tons of solutions, and that's the exciting part. Absolutely, things like coconut husk fibers are one of them. Rice hulls are definitely something you can mix with compost, and you can create very nice growing mediums. I don't know about wheat straw yet. It's something we're experimenting with, because in my part of Canada and the prairies, we have great access to wheat straw, not necessarily certified organic, which is what we need to source, but there is some certified organic material available. And so we're working with a local company to try to develop that into an actual alternative to peat moss. So there's lots of R&D happening, but it's one of those uphill kind of slow momentum things. But the snowball is starting to grow. That's for sure.
Interesting you mentioned rice hulls, because I've been investigating alternatives to perlite, which is another non-renewable resource, which is, I believe, mined from the ground. And rice hulls were the one thing that came up that were supposedly a good or a potential alternative. I did find an article, admittedly at the website perlite.org. So I suspect, there's something to be aware of in terms of reading the piece. It's talking about that, saying that rice hulls are not a viable alternative to perlite. I'm going to experiment with it and see how I get on, because I really don't like working with perlite. I find it very dusty and unpleasant to work with. So if I can find an organic alternative that is not a non-renewable resource, I will. But it seems we're in the very, very early days with this kind of stuff.
I would definitely agree with that. Thinking back to 22 years ago when I got into commercial growing, there was this real transition happening out of mineral soil and into the peat-based soilless media, which had a lot of convenience associated with it. And back in the day when growers would have that mineral soil, they would load it up with chemicals nonetheless to sterilize it. But I think that there's a return to the concept of living actual soil as the alternative, which can also have its pros and cons. Certainly topsoil is not a sustainable solution either, because that's being taken off the land and leaving behind a very scarred landscape for development or whatever is going to happen there. But the idea of returning to actual soils and getting away from the idea of these alternative soilless type growing spaces, like the growing mediums, I think is one of the ways forward.
For those of us who are on the other end of this equation as consumers, the trouble is it's just so easy to walk into the garden centre and pick up that bag which says Might well say organic on it and make us feel good with a picture of a nice houseplant on the front and think, oh, we're doing a good thing here. The time and energy which is required to actually do your research.
I would agree that as much as DIY is very much a great thing, that a lot of people love to do various kinds of DIY, there is that convenience factor when you just want to get home and pot your plants. You don't want to spend 4 hours researching and sourcing rice hulls and doing different things. So hopefully in the next little while, there will be some alternatives. I think that the wood fiber pulp, which can be derived from sustainable sources, perhaps rice hulls, there are some things that might come along in the near future, because there is momentum building on this, and consumers have a say. If consumers go to garden centers and they ask, I think that we start to have more of a voice to make change. There's no question.
With that in mind, do you produce for direct to consumers, or are you producing for garden centers and nurseries who then sell to consumers? What's your...
Yeah, sure thing. At Stage Garden, we are very much a direct to consumer type business. And this is a very intentional decision. At the very beginning, there was kind of a combination of wholesaling to other garden centers and selling to customers. But we've really appreciated and have a lot of passion for the opportunity to both listen and hear from gardeners as to what sort of challenges they're experiencing. They are, of course, craving all kinds of knowledge and information, and that's one of the things we love to do is share that back with people. And so as a grower, one of the things that has been a strength for us is the opportunity to align our gardener education with the way we do things ourselves. There's a lot of authenticity in it, and I sense from our customers that they really feel that when they come to our business, because it does smell good, and there's not that chemical aroma, and they can see the products that we're using, and we're kind of a medium-sized garden center. We're not a gigantic place, and we're not a little tiny place either, but there's enough of a scale where they can see that the operation is happening right there, and they can see what we're doing, that there's a lot of transparency. And so we appreciate that. And so that gives people a chance to really ask us how we do things and why we do things, and how that can translate into helpful suggestions for them at home.
We'll be back with more from Dave shortly, but first, let's hear from this week's show sponsor. Why do so many deodorants smell so, weird? I have no idea, but I'm excited to try Native's coconut and vanilla scented deodorant, because that's a smell I'm happy to put in my armpits. Native's deodorants come in a range of enticing scents, including lavender and rose, cucumber and mint, and eucalyptus and mint. Prefer no scent at all in your deodorant? They do that too. Native's products are not tested on animals, and they're free from aluminium or aluminum if you prefer, parabens and talc. So why not try out Native today? For 20% off your first purchase, visit nativedeodorant.com and use promo code ONTheLedge during checkout. Shipping is free on all orders to the United States, Canada, Australia, France, Germany and the UK. So for 20% off your first purchase, visit nativedeodorant.com and use promo code ONTheLedge during checkout. What things should we as consumers be looking out for when we go into, or when we're buying from a supplier, in terms of red flags or things that we need to look out for that we might not be aware of? So for example, this plant may come in a fancy coir pot that's recyclable, but actually it's full of neonicotinoids or there's some other issue. Are there sort of hidden things that we need to be aware of when it comes to sustainability that's not always obvious from looking at the plant? You've touched on probably the central problem here. Is there's some fairly obvious things that a lot of people put out there to sort of create an impression, or, to do their part. It's not always just greenwashing, but sometimes trying to take some steps towards sustainability. But then the industry, wherever you are, whether you're in North America, whether you're in Europe, whether you're in Great Britain, definitely this has become a global industry. And so a plant that you find at the shelf of your local garden center probably hasn't started life there. It might have started at a cutting farm in Africa or in South America or in Southeast Asia. And so along the way, there's a lot of different types of regulations that might govern how plants are grown in different regions. There's definitely export requirements for chemical drenches. There's all kinds of different applications of rules. And so your plant that arrives on your local garden center shelf has had a long journey, and there's a high likelihood that it hasn't been a very organic one. So it's important to try to, I think, and I will be fully, honest here, I'm an independent garden center operator and gardening educator. So my goal is to try to have those conversations with people, and I encourage people to come to me with these questions. But
when you go to many garden centers, it can be difficult to find out the provenance of plants, really. They might say, well, we grow them here, but probably that means that they've gotten in plug material that has come from quite far away. So starting to get to know some of the specifics. So what kinds of chemicals have been applied? Are there neonics applied? I know in North America, there's still a lot of controversy about this, and many of the commercial growers did not want to have a program where you'd have to label plants as treated with neonics. But consumers started to demand this. And so in some jurisdictions, that is a requirement, but it's very inconsistent at this point in time. A lot of the houseplant industry suffers from this problem because these plants travel from a very global perspective and they cross boundaries and borders. There is often export requirements to have them be drenched. And the most common types of chemical drenches for pest management are neonic type insecticides. So there's a lot of things that we just would never see and we'd never be able to analyze just by looking at the plant. So we have to be confident about asking the questions and try to get to know the reputation and the style of the local grower. And there's lots of ways you can do that. You can see if those folks are involved in the local gardening community. Are they talking about these issues? Are they trying to create a conversation around these exact topics that are very important? Or are they trying to kind of not talk about those things too much? So there's lots of little clues, but it's important to ask questions because there's not going to be a visual reference or any kind of signage at a garden center really likely to give you the full answer.
Let's just backtrack and just explain to anyone who's not fully aware what neonicotinoids are. So these are systemic insecticides which are used have been used on plants very widely. So rather than just acting at the point of the leaf or the stem, they're going into the root system and the vascular system of the plant and acting from within. And these have been linked with declining bee populations, haven't they? So not something that those of us who are trying to garden sustainably would be endorsing, I suspect, to say the least.
That's kind of it. And I think it's really because I hear various aspects of this conversation all the time. And so some people will say, well, but my rubber tree, which is going to be in my office, is never going to be exposed to a bee. So what's the big deal? And behind the scenes, that plant may have been growing at a nursery that has an outdoor production facility where the plants are regularly in the vicinity of bees. And so with the application of this style of insecticide, which is very long-lived within the tissues of that plant, it is known through science for sure at this point that it is impacting bees. So we have to think about the bigger context. So it's not just about where that plant is going to end up in your home or office or never going to be outdoors when you ultimately grow it on, but where did that plant come from and how is that affecting someone else's ecosystem and someone else's backyard? Because sometimes we forget that this is a very global thing, and so it's not just about how it's affecting our home, our office, our neighborhood, but how it's affecting the growers somewhere else in their local communities.
I think you could be sure if a plant doesn't say anything about neonics, then if a plant is neonicotinoid free, I'm sure that the supplier or grower will be shouting about it. If there's no mention of it, I think that's probably a possible indication that your plant has been treated with these systemic insecticides.
It's pretty common.
Yeah. I mean, I know here in the UK that there's a lot of pressure, consumer pressure and government pressure to stop companies from using these on plants. So it is starting to change. But that's a really, really good point. As you say, just because your plant isn't going to be into contact with bees, we've got to think about the wider picture. And I guess this fever for a lot of tropical plants is something that it's worth kind of thinking about in this context, because while it's lovely to go and pick up go to a big box store and pick up a really cheap philodendron or rubber plant, you do, if you were laid out for you what that plant's been through and where it's been and the miles involved, maybe you'd feel a bit differently about that plant. I think there's oftentimes there's that veil between us and what's happened to the things that we buy, that when it's lifted, we're a bit horrified.
Yes. I have this fantasy about having a podcast or a TV show or something where we just go to any given store and we sort of take our camera and we look at a product and then we get to go and trace its origin. Everything in the modern Western world really has a long journey to get to the shelf. And so we often forget about that. And it is important to consider for sure.
I guess this is where kind of disrupting this, gosh, I'm getting all sort of political here, but disrupting the system is kind of powerful in that obviously independent growers like yourself are doing amazing work in terms of providing a totally